Diffusion, the international science radio show.
We have a bouncer on the doors of perception.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
It gets pretty exciting.
The myths, the truths.
Toxicology.
Astroseismology.
Magnetism. The dark side.
Genetically engineered potatoes.
Planetoid.
Planetoid.
I love that word.
Hello and welcome to Diffusion. Sit back and relax while we inject weird and wonderful science directly into your dreams. I'm Ian Woolf. On this edition, Lana Kajlich returns to talk about National Science Week, and Dana Leidl talks about memory and amnesia. Science Week. Last week, Lana Kajlich told us about her work with Operation Crayweed. This week, she's back to tell us the news about her National Science Week activities.
So we've just actually had 2 outreach days, which were fantastic. The first of which was held at Sydney Institute of Marine Science. And we've had a morning session, which hosted a lot of schools from the Mossman local high school and students and young children that came as far afield as Central Coast. And basically what we had was a restoration workshop. So we were showcasing the crayweed restoration, but also the restoration of the seagrass Posidonia. And we were showing the animals that call that habitat home. We had a crayfish exhibit where people could come in and the kids were trying to find the crayfish among the crayweed. We also had a seahorse exhibit where the students had a look at an actual seahorse that was, collected from a local area. And that was, sort of coiled around a strand of beautiful Posidonia seagrass. And then we had other things which looked at this tiny small animals called epifauna. Epi meaning on and fauna animal. So the epifauna that live on the crayweed. And predominantly those animals live around the holdfast or that sort of foot of the seaweed or algae. And what we do is we immerse the seaweed into fresh water for just a short period of time, which causes the little epifauna to sort of release their hold of the seaweed. And then we're able to show the children and the adults as well under the microscope the many varied genera of animals that actually sort of call that habitat home. And that's the sort of important epifauna that support the crayfish and the abalone and the other fish species. So we can see the food cycle at play. And it's always wonderful to look under a microscope. The general public doesn't get the chance to do that very often. And we also had a Sex the Seaweed competition where people were able to say whether the crayweed was male or female based on the sex cells that they could see on the blade of seaweed. And then we had, learning how to attach the crayweed to mats. So we were really showcasing the restoration methods, but also we gave talks. Each scientist gave a talk from their perspective of genetics or restoration method or water quality or social research. So it was an all-in-all day of morning and afternoon at the Sydney Institute of Marine Science, and we hosted about 40 to 50 people, which was wonderful. The second outreach event that we had was at Science in the Wild at the Botanic Gardens over at Mount Annan. And we had a whole day where we had a very different demographic of people. We had mostly young toddlers and kids and families. So that was a wonderful experience. Like for some of those kids, it was probably their first time looking under the microscope. And we had the similar program that we offered: find the epifauna under the microscope, sex the seaweed, find the crayfish. And for a lot of people, it was also their first time seeing crayfish. And, many said that looked quite delicious. So that was a really great day, from 11 till 3:30, where we met a lot of the public and talked about our restoration projects and gave flyers and, let them know who we are. So that was great.
Are there habitats around Manhattan? Or
No, I guess being far from the coast, it's pretty far. But a lot of the families were mentioning that they often go to Bundeena and they often go down to Wollongong, where crayweed is quite predominant, and also up to the north in Central Coast, where they'll see a lot of Posidonia seagrass. So for them, it's day trips and it's weekend trips and it's also holidays. And they told us that they were fascinated to learn a little bit more about the habitat that they sort of walk past as wrack on the beach. And for a lot of the kids, they were just incredibly passionate about science. So giving them that opportunity to look under a microscope and also to see about a habitat and discover more about that was really beneficial. So they told us that they really enjoyed that.
Could you imagine getting kids in the field?
Absolutely. So like I mentioned, we've had a few school groups that have come down and helped us with video monitoring, but we've also had some outreach events where schools have come down to the intertidal area and scientists have emerged on scuba out of the water carrying, some sea urchins and sea stars and showing them some of the associated fauna that associates in that habitat of crayweed. And we're definitely looking at ways of having school kids help with the restoration methods, perhaps methods that don't involve being on scuba or being underwater. And we're looking into some methods that might involve, crayweed bombs, where the crayweed themselves are just in bags, biodegradable bags, and cast into the ocean using, weights. So there's also that possibility in the future. That's where the science and research questions come to play, is whether those restoration methods would be effective. And that might be a way of sort of both engaging the public in a sort of non-underwater, above-water safe environment, but also, that would be a way of, scaling up the restoration, and the costs associated with that would be obviously much, much more reduced. So we're very keen to get high school students involved in hands-on science. There's also the head of school, Associate Professor Alistair Poore, has been looking at ways of getting the depth study within the Australian curriculum. They've just introduced in the science curriculum something called the depth study unit. And then that's a unit where high school students actively reach out to scientists at UNSW and might learn from the scientists and conduct a research question that would be of real value to science. So by sort of reaching out that way, Alistair Poore has got a program, and that's a program where the students are able to work with scientists, ask them questions, work in a lab, and even develop their own research question that might even lead to their own scientific paper. So that's another way that we're really, really keen to get high school students actively involved in working in real science.
Is there somewhere online where students or teachers could contact you to get involved in those sort of programs?
Yes, they'd definitely be able to reach me through Operation Crayweed, and my contact details are available through that. And we're sort of working together collaboratively on that project, so I'd love to hear from any students who'd be keen to work with Alistair Poore on that project as well.
Well, Lana, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian, for having me on your program. It's been a pleasure.
That was Lana Kajlich, talking about her National Science Week events with the University of New South Wales and the Sydney Institute of Marine Science. You're listening to Ian Woolf on Diffusion Science Radio. Send emails to science@diffusionradio.com. We're brought to you across Australia on the Community Radio Network and podcast over the internet on www.diffusionradio.com. Memories are powerful, but not always reliable. Forgetting everything, amnesia, is a nightmare often portrayed in movies. Dana Leidl is a PhD student at the School of Psychology at the University of New South Wales. Dana is studying the neurobiology of memory. I began by asking her, how does memory work?
Well, memory is super important in shaping who we are as we sit here today. So our personality could be made up of many things that have happened to us, and the skills that we've learned, the relationships we've had. So our memory of all of those things really contributes to who we are today. It also helps us imagine who we're going to be in the future and helps us plan and decide what we're going to do. So it's kind of central to who we are.
Sometimes things go wrong with memory, or more right than you would ever expect.
Yeah, so many people think that, or assume that memory is like a recording device. So it's just taking in what's around us and storing it in some perfect archive, which is not really true. Our brain can't take in everything, and sometimes it makes mistakes. So we might say that the brain kind of takes snapshots from our experiences and just fills in the blanks. And sometimes those blanks are wrong. So sometimes we remember things that haven't happened to us. We remember things in a different way to how they've happened. Sometimes we just remember things that we've imagined happened, and we commit those to memory and think that that's it. Definitely. And then memories can also change over time. So it's not the case that once they're laid down to memory, that they stay that way forever.
There are people with exceptionally good memories, though.
There are. Great point. So it's not my area of research, but it's something I find incredibly interesting. So I was reading, that there's like 10 or so people in the world that have been validated with a particularly extreme form of memory, and they can apparently remember everything that's ever happened to them. Amazing. I can't tell you how it works, unfortunately. I don't know if anybody knows how it works. When there's so few cases, it must be hard to tell, to get a good hypothesis.
Is that an eidetic memory, a photographic memory?
I was thinking of a different kind. I think it's called Hyperthymesia. Again, not my area of research. I was mainly just watching a lot of YouTube videos of people that can recall, say, what day of the week it was 3 years ago and what they were wearing and like remember everything exactly. So not like in visuals, but I guess they just know.
And then there's people who have very bad memories indeed.
Definitely. There's lots of different ways that memories can go wrong. And there's obviously a huge interest in understanding that, particularly in like older adults as memory declines in old age. A lot of people want to know what they can be doing to improve their memories and protect themselves from these kind of declines.
Do you know anything about what people can do to protect themselves?
There's a couple of different things that have kind of been shown to be helpful and to protect, and things like diet and exercise, which many people take for granted as being important, but there is actually a lot of evidence that correlates between, exercising regularly with improved brain health, eating well. We know that diets that are high in saturated fats and high in sugars can be damaging for memory and cognition. So yeah, things that you think are pretty basic can actually be quite helpful. But of course, we all know that there are people that have been eating well their whole lives and exercising regularly, and they will still experience changes in their memory or a decline in their memory as they age. So there's a variety of factors at play.
And what about things like they talk about cognitive reserve theory, where if you've done a really interesting job or had lots of academic education, that gives you this maybe a little bit of boost to survive the decline a little bit longer.
Yes, I have read about that as well, only very recently. So they think of it in terms of the cognitive reserve and then also, the neurological reserve? So two kind of ways that you can bolster your protective factors. So the ones that I was talking about, the exercise and diet, might come under your brain health reserve, and then also the cognitive reserve. So doing complex things and helping to keep your brain active might fall under that heading.
I've seen them talk about learning languages and learning to play a musical instrument, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I was reading one study that was the task they had was just learning digital photography and learning how to use an iPad. So things like that, people are very interested in seeing if they can improve memory in older age.
And then there's things, while we're talking about improving memory, mnemonic systems, the old memory systems of the ancient Greeks that seem to be still very powerful, but they're not taught in schools.
Yeah, they can be incredibly useful because we know that our ability to remember things can sometimes depend on how deeply we process information. I'm not sure if this is directly connected to mnemonics, but so we know if we just read something once, we're very prone to forgetting it. But if we read it and we really think about what it means, we're processing it deeper and committing it to memory. So when we use mnemonics, sometimes that can be a feature, is you're thinking about something in more detail and you're processing it more and considering its meaning, making it more relevant to help you recall it later.
That's how study ideally is meant to work, right? That you think about the lecture material or the material in the textbooks and you go over it and you analyse it, and so the extra work that you do is what helps you remember it.
Yeah, exactly. So rearranging information, considering its meaning, making it personal, learning about something but thinking about, well, when has this happened to me, or do I know someone this has happened to, can be hugely helpful in remembering things, definitely.
And some of the memory systems are based on creating a story to remember things as well. So you might have things that are images that you associate with the things you're trying to remember, and then you link all those images into a story, and the human brain seems to work well with stories.
I'm sure that there's a huge amount of research in why we work so well with stories. I'm not familiar with it, but I know that the way that we recall memories, it kind of is like a spark of network. So you remember one thing, which helps you remember the next thing. If I was to ask you what's like the second line in your favourite song, you might have no idea, but once you sing the first line, you know immediately. So the kind of one thing triggers the next. And so perhaps that's why we work so well with stories.
Sounds reasonable to me. And there's a historical case where they found exactly what part of the brain controls recall because they cut it out.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of how it works. So it's a really famous case. He's probably the most studied man in memory and maybe medicine. His name, we call him Patient HM. And the story kind of goes like this. He had a bicycle accident when he was a young boy. It didn't change his memory, but it gave him these seizures. And so he had these seizures as all the way through as he grew up, and they were intractable, uncontrollable, really bad, and they didn't respond to any medication. So his doctors at the time took quite a drastic approach, and they localised where the seizures were coming from, and they removed that whole part of the brain. And that part of the brain is the medial temporal lobe, so it's kind of under your ears and deep inside, and they removed that. And the good news was when he woke up, he didn't have any seizures, and his personality, his intellect was intact. I think he was 27 at the time, but the bad news was that his memory was completely changed, and it was changed forever. So what he lost was the ability to form new memories. So each day his doctor would come in and say hello, and he'd have to reintroduce himself again. And that time frame of forgetting could be much, much shorter. In fact, it was much, much shorter than that. So even if he got distracted in a conversation, it would just kind of reset and he'd have to start again. But we learnt a lot about memory from his life, and he was studied for decades. And so we learnt a lot. We learnt about the neurobiology, so what kind of regions are particularly important. We also learnt that there are different types of memory, because I say that he lost his ability to form new memories, but we also know he could form some types of memories, some things we may not even think about when we think about memory.
Although he forgot the episodes of his life that happened after the surgery, he was able to learn new skills.
That's exactly right. So that helps us understand that memory is not this unitary system. It's made up of different parts. So you use the word episode. So he's got this episodic memory, things that he remembers that happened to him, what we usually think of as memory. So that he wasn't able to form new episodic memories, but he could learn new skills. So in one task, they'd have him trace a star, but only by looking in a mirror. You can imagine that's very hard because everything's in reverse. I've tried it. It's very difficult. And what they found was that after doing this training, so trying to draw the star over many, many days, he got much better. So he wasn't going outside the lines. But he had no recollection of ever having done it. So he thought that this was the first time he was doing it, but they could see that he was improving. So we might call that procedural memory, or kind of like skill memory. And so we know that that's dealt differently in the brain to episodic memory.
People that lose their memory, amnesia is in the movies and TV stories all the time. So for one, that is something that happens to people without that surgery.
Yeah, amnesia comes up so often in movies. It's such a great plot point. And I guess it might be interesting to note that there are two different types of amnesia. So the first one is retrograde amnesia, so forgetting things that have happened to you. So that might be like born identity, or, there's so many. So born identity, where you forgot things that have happened to you. And there are some fascinating real life cases. It does happen in real life, not just the movies. And then there's also anterograde amnesia. So that's the inability to form new memories. So maybe like Dory from Finding Nemo, or a female character in 50 First Dates, things like that. So that's anterograde amnesia. In reality, they can often co-occur, and you often will lose some portion of your past memories. So you'd have some retrograde with some anterograde. They very rarely occur just by themselves. And there's heaps of different ways that you can get amnesia as well. So we spoke about HM losing a part of his brain that was very important in memory, but you can also have viral infections and head trauma, a number of different ways that can damage your ability to form or recall memories.
You've got people with ridiculously good memories and kind of very good memories and sort of average memories and poor memories, or even no memory, but you can also remember things that didn't happen.
Yes. So when we remember something that hasn't happened to us, we usually call it a false memory. And these can happen to us throughout the day, every day. So when you go to pick your keys up off the kitchen bench because you remember putting them there and they're not there, that might be a false memory. And they come up a lot, and they can be the source of a lot of like he said, she said arguments. And it's very hard to know what really happened if you don't have a third party. You might have experienced that in your own life. And they can be inconsequential. We just will never know who was right. But they can also have kind of devastating consequences. So the obvious example of that is the case of eyewitness testimonies. So when people are giving eyewitness accounts and they're being totally honest, they're not lying, but they've remembered that somebody else committed the crime. And eyewitness testimonies, we know, can be very persuasive. And so we know that there are a lot of people that are incarcerated for crimes now that they didn't commit based on these honest but false accounts. So there's one kind of classic case study of a man who was a ticket seller, and he was robbed one night after work, held at gunpoint, so it was quite serious, quite traumatic. And then he pulled someone out of a lineup and said, "That's the guy." And he pulled out a sailor. And it turns out that the sailor had this ironclad alibi. It definitely could not have been him. And it turns out that the ticket seller hadn't formed a clear memory of the perpetrator of the actual crime, but he had served this sailor at his ticket booth 3 times before. So what he'd done is he'd kind of merged this familiar face onto the perpetrator and was quite confident that that was the man. So that's one way that false memories can have quite bad consequences.
I think in a way it's what some stage magicians do when they're presenting illusions, is they get you to remember things that couldn't have happened.
That's so cool. I'd never considered that. So do you have an example?
There's a technique in magic called misdirection, and it's not just about getting you to look somewhere else. There's a thing called time misdirection. So if you do something that's actually the nasty move that you don't want people to see, but the effect isn't visible till later, people will forget the innocent looking move.
Yeah.
Whereas if they're right together, they might associate them and catch you out.
Yeah.
But if there's a bit of time, and politicians I know use this type of time misdirection because they expect you to forget that they changed. They gave the police extra powers against terrorists just last year and the year before and the year before and the year before and the year before. And so maybe they don't need the extra powers this year.
Yeah.
But they expect you to forget, and you usually do.
Yeah. Freaky.
So time misdirection is one of those memory playing sort of games that they use. But with magicians, it's just for entertainment.
Yeah.
And the other one I'd heard about in relation to all this is that, so when you're laying down a memory, is that consolidation?
Yeah, that's usually the term that we use when we're storing or we're converting a memory from our short-term memory into our long-term memory. It's being consolidated.
And so there's also reconsolidation.
Reconsolidation has attracted a lot of interest in the literature in recent years. So it's this idea that once we recall a memory, we retrieve a memory, that it needs to be laid back down into our long-term memory, and that we call that process reconsolidation. And this has attracted a lot of tension because people are very interested to see if they can disrupt that reconsolidation, they can stop it from happening, as a way to kind of targetedly delete memories. So that's why it's become of a lot of interest. Yeah.
Now that sounds a little sinister, but they've actually got good intentions, don't they?
Of course, always good intentions. So you and I might have some memories that we'd rather forget. And these might be awkward moments, embarrassing moments, but there are also strong memories that can form the basis for anxiety disorders. So traumatic memories that form the basis for post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. So researchers and psychiatrists are really interested in getting to the basis of these disorders and seeing if they can disrupt those memories to improve the quality of life for individuals with disorders like PTSD. So the idea is that if the person has a particular trauma memory, so say it's something like a car accident, that they could come into the lab or the psychiatrist's office and recall that memory, so bring it up into a state that's kind of amenable to disruption, and then maybe be given a drug or some other treatment that would stop it from being laid back down. And this has kind of been shown in some laboratory studies and some small clinical trials that this is potentially an effective way for changing memories. So in these cases, it's not necessarily deleting memories, but they're changing the emotional aspect of the emotional content of the memory, so taking away the distressing components.
So you still can recall what happened, but it no longer makes you terrified or have really bad anxiety symptoms.
Exactly. So you retain what we call the declarative memory, so the knowledge that it's happened, but it doesn't have that power to cause the emotional reaction.
Which sounds like the best of both worlds. You don't lose your episodic memory, but it doesn't hurt you anymore.
Exactly. So that's why it's attracted so much interest, because it would be incredible if we could do this. The results from animal studies are quite promising, but the human memory system is much more complex. So there's kind of been mixed results and some failures to replicate. So it's not out there yet as I guess a treatment, but it's something that researchers are very interested in and putting a lot of effort into. So knowing that memory is such a huge part of our everyday life, but it's also so prone to mistakes and it's valuable, has made me incredibly interested in studying memory. So I guess that's why I'm pursuing my PhD starting this year, and I can just learn more and more about memory and hopefully chat to you again.
Well, Dana, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
That was Dana Leidl talking about memory and forgetting in the School of Psychology at the University of New South Wales. And that's all from us this week on Diffusion. Would you like to hear your voice on radio? Record a voice memo on your phone or use the voicemail tab on the website. We need more people contributing stories to Diffusion. Send your contributions, opinions, helpful suggestions and donations to science@diffusionradio.com. That's science@diffusionradio.com. And please do send me an email with a question I can answer on the show. Please like the Diffusion Science Radio page on Facebook and rate us on iTunes. Tell your friends. Follow me on Twitter @Ian Woolf. Join my patrons at patreon.com/diffusionradio and support the show. Sound checking by Charles Willock. I produce Diffusion, which is broadcast around Australia to 26 stations on the Community Radio Network, including 2 RBM in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, 8CCC in Alice Springs and Tennant Creek, 2 NVR in Nambucca Valley, 3 MBR in the Mallee Border districts of Victoria and South Australia, 7 LTN City Park Radio in Launceston, Tasmania, and my local station 2RDJ in Burwood, New South Wales. Diffusion is syndicated globally on the National Science Foundation's Science 360 internet radio station and also on astronomy.fm. Subscribe to the podcast on the Diffusion website, www.diffusionradio.com. That's www.diffusionradio.com, and check the website for links, photos and videos about this week's show. If you enjoyed the show, you can explore more than 900 previous episodes archived on diffusionradio.com, where the shows are labelled by keywords so you can focus in on the stories you want to hear. Subscribe to the Diffusion YouTube channel at youtube.com/c/diffusionradio. I'm Ian Woolf. Join us inside your audio device of choice for more science wondering next week on Diffusion Science Radio.
Science is fun. It helps you to learn, to know, and to appreciate. When you study science, you may go on field trips. You discover the marvelous interrelationships between all living things. You learn to read the history of the Earth as it is written in rocks and fossils. You find out what makes things tick, everything from a molecule to a living organism. In the study of science is found the most useful and satisfying knowledge of man. Knowledge of his physical world, its past, its present, and its future. And in your moments of relaxation, now and in the years to come, you will find the study of science leading you into fascinating pursuits. Photography, collecting. Why study science? Study science because you will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.